Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. When Argentina seized the Falkland Islands at the start of April 1982, almost nobody believed that Britain would be able to retake them, not even Britain's own Defence Secretary. But just 3 weeks later, the Royal Navy had created a task force out of thin air, sailed it 8,000 miles around the world, and begun the task of taking its territory back. This is the story of how they did it. The challenge for Britain in trying to take back the Falkland Islands by force was a huge one. The islands were 8,000 miles away and occupied by a nation with over 300 modern aircraft that could fly from air bases only a few hundred miles away from the islands. A British task force would be outnumbered, a long way from any help, and would need to be supported by a logistical train which didn't exist at the start of April 1982. It would be the riskiest military deployment since the disaster of the Suez Crisis 3 decades before. This didn't stop the Royal Navy under the leadership of Admiral Henry Leach from being convinced it was possible. With the Defence Secretary John Knott being pessimistic, Leach told the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher that the first wave of a full task force, including 2 aircraft carriers, could be sailed within days, and that the Navy could take the islands back by force if required. Convinced by Admiral Leach's enthusiasm, Thatcher gave the green light, and Her Majesty's Naval Service swung into action. In a stroke of good fortune, the Navy had the core of a large-scale deployment already assembled at Gibraltar. The first flotilla had been conducting exercises under Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward. At 2:30 AM on April 3rd, just hours after the Argentine invasion of the Falklands, Woodward departed for the South Atlantic, leading a group of 5 frigates and 5 destroyers, which would make up the core of the carrier group charged with taking the islands back. Back in England, frantic work was just beginning to provide Woodward ships with some aircraft carriers to escort. When Argentina invaded, both of Britain's carriers were alongside at Portsmouth. Hermes was even in the middle of a 6-week maintenance period. There was furious activity to get them operational in early April. Within days, anti-submarine Sea Kings were being flown up from Royal Naval Air Station Culdrose, joined by transport helicopters and every available Sea Harrier from RNAS Yeovilton. With its vertical takeoff and landing ability, the Sea Harrier could land directly onto the carriers whilst they were still in port, saving valuable time. As a result, on April 5th, both Hermes and Invincible left Portsmouth in a blaze of publicity intended as a statement to Argentina of Britain's resolve. It had been just 3 days since the Argentine invasion. As well as warships, Britain also had to find ground troops capable of landing on and liberating the Falklands. 3 Royal Marine and 2 parachute battalions were quickly earmarked for service in the South Atlantic, but the Navy didn't have any way of getting them there. To solve this, the British government turned to its age-old power to requisition the nation's merchant ships in time of war. The 45,000-ton cruise liner Canberra, which was by coincidence on her way back to the UK from the Mediterranean, was quickly targeted. UK officials boarded the ship at Gibraltar, assessing the modifications she would need for service in the South Atlantic. A plan for a custom-built helicopter landing pad to go over the swimming pool was designed on the back of an envelope, telephoned back to the UK, and fabricated before the liner even arrived back in England. Canberra docked at Southampton on April 7th, disembarked her passengers, had extensive modifications, and sailed 60 hours later with 2,500 Royal Marines and paratroopers on board. It was a remarkable turnaround. Absolutely nothing had been allowed to stand in the way of her departure. It was a similar story up and down the country as dozens of civilian ships were pressed into service for all kinds of roles as Britain tried to construct an 8,000-mile-long logistics chain from scratch in a few days. By the end of April, there were 65 ships at sea, of which 40 were either Royal Fleet Auxiliary Support ships or civilian ships pressed into service. Sailing south as fast as their diesel engines would carry them, the nascent task force headed first for British-controlled Ascension Island in the mid-Atlantic. arriving there piecemeal throughout April and May 1982. This tiny and quiet island in the Atlantic became subject to a frenzy as the ships of the task force arrived and the RAF lifted in everything the task force needed but could not for whatever reason take with it from the UK. At its peak, the island's airport handled over 400 flights a day, making Ascension briefly the busiest airport in the world. This huge operation was supported in no small part by the United States, though in secret, as the Americans were trying to broker a diplomatic solution to the crisis. The airbase on the island was run by the US to support a NASA satellite tracking station, and its commander, Lieutenant Colonel W. Bryden, reportedly said that he had been ordered to help, but not to get caught doing it. The US kept the fuel tanks at Ascension topped up, and funneled shipments of the latest type of Sidewinder air-to-air missile into British hands. After a brief stop, Rear Admiral Woodward's carrier battle group departed Ascension Island on April 18th. It would take another 2 weeks for the carriers to reach the Falklands, but Britain was not going to wait that long to start military operations. Sailing ahead of the main force was a task group bound for South Georgia, a British territory about 900 miles southeast of the Falklands, that the Argentinians had seized on April 3rd. HMS Antrim, Plymouth and the tanker Tidespring had now been dispatched to take it back, carrying a company of Royal Marines as well as D Squadron from the SAS. This force would link up with the ice patrol ship HMS Endurance, who had remained at sea monitoring the Argentine occupiers since the start of the month. The task group, under the command of Captain Brian Young, arrived off South Georgia on April 21st. Wasting no time, the British ships immediately began operations against Argentine positions, but ran into trouble when 2 Wessex 5 helicopters crashed whilst recovering an SAS reconnaissance patrol west of Leith. Those involved were eventually rescued without loss by this aircraft, HMS Antrim's Wessex 3, but it was a sharp reminder of the fraught danger that came with operating in this part of the world. The situation did not get much better for the British when intelligence arrived the following day that an Argentinian submarine was in the vicinity of South Georgia. This was a massive threat. If a submarine could pick off one of the British ships, that could spell the end of the South Georgia operation and possibly the entire Falklands campaign, if the political and public will to continue collapsed in the face of a military setback. Captain Young withdrew his force out to sea for safety, where they were reinforced on April 24th by the frigate HMS Brilliant, who had been detached from the vanguard of the task force some days earlier and came with 2 Lynx anti-submarine helicopters. With this added strength, the British force returned to South Georgia with the exception of RFA Tidespring, which was carrying the Marine Company and was kept out of harm's way for the time being. On the morning of April 25th, the British warships mobilised their helicopters to hunt down the Argentine submarine. In the lead again was Antrim's Wessex 3, nicknamed Humphrey and piloted by Lieutenant Commander Ian Stanley. Stanley and his crew searched initially with only the naked eye to avoid detection by their opponent, before resorting to a single sweep on the helicopter's radar to see if they could locate the boat. Almost immediately, the ARA Santa Fe appeared on Humphrey's radar screen. The submarine was steaming northwest on the surface, having dropped a platoon of Marines at Grytviken to reinforce the Argentine garrison there. Lieutenant Commander Stanley called in its location before dropping 2 depth charges, one of which physically bounced off Santa Fe's conning tower before exploding. At this, the submarine turned back towards Grytviken, a small oil slick becoming visible on the surface, an indication of damage within. A link from HMS Brilliant was next on the scene, firing off a homing torpedo before WAFs from Endurance and Plymouth opened fire with their AS-12 rocket missiles. The first of these, from Lieutenant Commander John Ellerbeck's aircraft, was the first missile ever fired by the Royal Navy in anger. The missiles were not big enough to do serious damage to the submarine, but they punched enough holes in the conning tower to prevent Santa Fe from submerging. Harried by almost half a dozen helicopters, Santa Fe limped her way into Grytviken harbour, where her crew abandoned the sub and made their way to the garrison's position at King Edward Point. It was at this stage that the British decided to press their advantage. The element of surprise was now gone, and it wouldn't do to allow the Argentine reinforcements to settle in. It was time, as Major Cedric Delves, in command of the SAS at South Georgia, puts it, to go with instinct, fast and furious. The Royal Marine Company, who had been intended to lead the assault on Grytviken, were that afternoon still 200 miles away aboard RFA Tidespring, so any quick assault would have to go in without them, using the SAS troops and a handful of Royal Marines that were on board the other ships. They'd be facing about 100 defenders in prepared positions, but had the crucial advantage of naval gunfire and helicopters. The operation began at 2:30 PM, with the SAS and Marines being carried ashore by Humphrey and Brilliant's Lynxes. They landed south of Grytviken and pushed up the Brown Mountain Ridge, while 4.5-inch naval shells bombarded King Edward Point, though aimed at this stage to land near the defenders to demoralise them rather than cause casualties. The land troops, under the command of Royal Marine Major Guy Sheridan, then advanced to within 1,000 yards of the garrison, before HMS Antrim steamed right into the bay and threatened to fire directly at the Argentines unless they surrendered. A voice soon came back on the radio. "No shoot, no shoot." The Argentinian commander, Lieutenant Commander Luis Lagos, appreciated the overwhelming strength of his opponents and, like the British Royal Marines 3 weeks earlier, wisely decided to surrender. With this and the surrender of Lieutenant Alfredo Astiz at Leith the following day, South Georgia was restored to British control. Captain Young sent a signal that was passed on to London, proclaiming,
"Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen."
What had begun as a fraught and almost disastrous operation ended in complete success for the British, with an early victory banked and the credibility of the Navy to carry out operations in the South Atlantic cemented. There was just one fatality on South Georgia, Chief Petty Officer Felix Artuso, who was tragically shot dead after the surrender when a Royal Marine Guard thought he was trying to scuttle the Santa Fe. And so, with the first military victory in the bag, the Royal Navy's ships departed, with Captain Young's ships rejoining the main British task force on April 29th. The carriers were now approaching the Falklands, and the prospect of any diplomatic solution was receding fast. The Falklands War was about to begin in earnest, and begin with one of the most controversial military actions since the Second World War. I'll see you next time. This video is sponsored by Squarespace. A great choice if you're looking to create a website for your latest idea or project. Your website on Squarespace can sit at the centre of your online community, with powerful blogging tools that allow you to categorise and schedule your posts easily, as well as being able to push content from your website straight to social feeds automatically. You can also connect with your audience in dedicated members-only areas, all in one easy-to-use platform. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/historigraph to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.